Guten Nacht, everyone. A huge welcome to everyone from around the world. So happy that you're joining us this evening. Marco Weinberg, welcome. You are joining us from where in the world?
I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Hi there, Howie.
Hello. That doesn't sound like a North Carolinian accent, though.
I'll never get one of those.
How long have you been out of South Africa?
Not that long, about 7 years, 8 years. And still very strong ties to the motherland.
Your parents are in South Africa, is that right?
They are. They both live in Joburg.
And how did you decide on North Carolina as home?
I just moved here about a year ago. Before that, I was in San Diego for most of the time, and it was really just connections with folks in the area in San Diego, and then here it was for a job move.
So you're at the bleeding edge of science. Is North Carolina a big science hub as opposed to Southern California?
I don't know if science is the right word. I think biotech or biomedicine is a major. It's one of the sort of top 3 destinations for biomedical research. So yeah, I would say this part of the world is a big hub, but it's not the only one in the US. I think there are about 4 or 5 other places where a lot of research is going on. Yeah.
And how did North Carolina vote in the elections?
Don't speak to me about that. This is a very interesting state. You move maybe 10, 15 kilometers outside of the cities, and then you're in the rural heartland of America. And so you have a very sort of town country divide in this state. And it's, well, depending on which way you like your politics, it's a reliably red state for the most part, but it does on the odd occasion vote blue, which is the Democrat party. So,
and that's generally always the case. That's pretty much everywhere in the States, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a swing state. I mean, this is a state where you can, if the Democrats get their act together, they can actually win a few elections, but it doesn't always happen that way. Yeah.
And of course, the most famous son of North Carolina is in fact Stephen Colbert, the late night talk show host.
The comedian. Yeah.
The comedian.
Yeah, I think, is it North Carolina or South Carolina he's from?
I thought he was North Carolina.
I'm not sure, but definitely he's lost his North Carolina twang.
So Danny Myersveld, it looks like you have a beautiful view. Is that the Santon skyline behind you?
That is definitely not. That is the Sea Point Promenade behind me.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'm sitting here with a little bit of sunburn after I put too much time on the beach today. But I was desperate to get out of Johannesburg after the year we've had, so nice to be down here at the coast.
So let's talk about what's happening on the coast, in particular about wearing masks and people taking precautions. Does COVID exist in Sea Point?
Very much so. I've actually been pretty impressed by how compliant people seem to be. So, and not so much on the beaches. People are certainly keeping their distance, but I've been going to places that would normally be quite busy. They're a lot quieter. It almost feels like Cape Town's in a bit of a self-imposed lockdown at the moment, to be honest. And yeah, I think people are starting to take it quite seriously again after maybe slacking for a couple of weeks.
And a few questions. Eva Maisels asks, have we started yet? And Eva, no, the answer is we're starting at 8:30 because we're accommodating those people in Cape Town who are keeping Shabbat. Shabbat comes out at about 8:36 in Cape Town, so they'll miss the first few minutes of our broadcast. But we've at least delayed our start. We normally start at 8 p.m. We've gone to 8:36. And Aaron Gersh says, do you have to be Jewish to join this webinar? And are you certain? And how do we know? And of course, the answer is you definitely don't have to be Jewish, Aaron, because we reckon that about 30, 40, 50% of our audience that watch us are not Jewish at all. And not only that, we estimate about 35% of the people who watch us are not in South Africa. So we have a following. It was very interesting. We had Jewish Achiever Awards last weekend, and I went onto YouTube and to see where people were watching us from. And we have a following in places like Peru, Brazil, Costa Rica. We're very big in Canada and the United States. About 600 people watched from the United States and about 400 people from Canada. Big audiences in Europe and in Israel as well. Great following in places like Nigeria, Kenya, and the DRC. And we do have a few people who watch us in Australia, although the time is not good for the Australians, so that they tend to catch up to us. And I see, for example, Eva is saying hello from Toronto. Fonda is in Eilat. Erica is in Connecticut in the USA. Aubrey and Etienne are in Toronto. We have someone in San Diego. So we really are being watched all over the world. So we're just catching up on COVID around the country. Yesterday, we are, about 8,300 new infections around South Africa. And Marco, what's happening in North Carolina with COVID? You're on the second wave. You're well into the second wave there.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as bad as California, but it's pretty bad here too, in the sense that the numbers are at the record levels. For the last 6 or 7 months, I don't think we've had these kind of numbers. So definitely in the thick of it right now.
And are people adhering to mask and social distancing protocols, or is that too political in the United States?
I think the ones in the cities here, I've seen mostly people adhere to them, but there is definitely some fatigue in the population, and you can see it sometimes at the restaurants and so on, where folks definitely don't wear masks at times. So, this is why the United States is in the situation it is. It's in it, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's amazing that something so simple, so medical, and so basic became so political in the United States. And it does remind me. I was on a webinar with someone who was promoting the use of the anti-malarial drugs for COVID, and Professor Mervyn Muir came on and said, "Look, in South Africa, we actually just don't care. It's not a political issue here. We've tried it in our hospitals. We'd love it to work. We've tried it multiple times. It just doesn't work. We wish it did, but it's not political. It's pure science. It's black and white." So Scott Hazelhurst, welcome. As we welcome you, we also welcoming, we see Erica's in Connecticut, Bev is in the Carmel, Felicia is in Atlanta, Hillary's in Jerusalem, Lydia's in Cape Town, Mervyn Sky is in Miami, and I can't see who the next person is, but they're talking about Wits. So Professor Scott Hazelhurst, welcome. Where in the world are you tonight?
I am in Johannesburg.
And there's one hell of a storm brewing outside. I don't know if it's lightning and thundering at you.
It's just finished. I thought we might be in trouble, but we seem to be in a good state right now. So I think we won't be disturbed by that.
And there's also was due to be load shedding at 8 o'clock this evening, which hasn't quite begun either.
Just as well. I didn't see that. So yeah, that would have been a bit of a disappointment.
So we're just having an informal chat. We're going to begin this panel in about 5 or 6 minutes time, and we're just welcoming everyone on board. And it's so nice. For example, Veronica in Sea Point, Robin is in Sea Point. People are talking about WITS. So Scott, you lecture at WITS. How has it been over the past year? Has it been a very challenging year in the academic world and trying to get students through their degrees?
Yes, I think it's been very difficult for everyone. So I think for the academic staff, it's been very frustrating. It's been very time consuming to do it. Obviously losing contact with your students is quite distressing. And I think for students, it's much worse because they have the stress of needing to pass at the end of the year. And many of them are disconnected from their colleagues. We have many students who live in rural areas and normally would be in the university residences. And for them, it's been a particularly trying year because they have access to power, and good internet has been a massive challenge for them. So we've managed. I think we've done well under the circumstances. But I don't think anyone has been happy with the experience.
So before we discuss that more, just a good evening to Selwyn in Mully Point. I see Bernice has joined us from Netanya. Aubrey's in Century City. We have some people in Hilton Head in South Carolina. Marco, how far is South Carolina from North Carolina?
Oh, geez, I haven't been down there. It's probably about 2-hour drive at most from where I am.
Hilton Head, isn't that where people go to play golf?
Yeah, that's on the coast. The coast is about 2.5 to 3 hours away, depending on which part of the coast. And Hilton Head, I think, is on the corner between North Carolina and South Carolina, so it's not far away.
So to the people watching us in South Carolina, in particular Hilton Head, don't forget to invite Marco over. He'd make a fantastic guest. If you're looking for somewhere to go for Shabbos dinner, we can get you an invite.
Oh.
And I see Raymond's watching us from Brentwood in Essex in England, and Isaac is telling me that we're completely wrong about hydroxychloroquine and that it actually works. We're just doing it incorrectly. And welcome to Ivan in Bantry Bay as well. So Scott, have you finished marking exams, and how did the students actually do?
I think that yes, fortunately, I'm very pleased to say we finished marking the exams, and I think most students managed reasonably well under the circumstances. But I think that there was definitely limitations on what we could do. So, for example, we do a lot of lab work, and for many students, they weren't able to get the same depth of experience as they normally would. So the students on the whole have coped. There's some students who really struggled, both psychologically and just with lack of resources. And as I say, students in rural areas, or we have quite a lot of international students also had a lot of difficulty, but they've managed.
So Scott, of the people on the screen tonight, how many of them have passed through your hands?
None of them have passed through my hands. Marco is a former collaborator of mine, so it's very nice to see Marco. I think it's about 2 years since I saw him in person, so it's great to be able to see him.
It's good to see all of you, actually. It's a nice family reunion, almost.
And Danny, what is your connection to the other people on the screen? Have you ever worked with any of them?
So Marco was in the lab next to me when I was doing my PhD many moons ago. But no, I haven't worked with Hazelhurst.
So the funny thing is, when I was chatting to Marco the other day, and I said, I see we have Muslim Schlange in common, and Musa and I have been very close friends since the moment he arrived in South Africa. And Marco's response was, "Oh my goodness, you're the Howie." So we've never actually met, but we have a.
I think
very,
that works
very good...
for you. You should permanently put "the" before your name, Howie.
It may be true. So welcome as well to Raymond, who's watching us from. I see. Sorry, it was not Raymond. It's Michael, who's watching us from Boston. And he's originally from Springs. So I'm not sure if that's an elevation or a demotion between Springs and Boston. But having spent a few years in Boston studying myself, I'm a big fan of the Cambridge area. So, Michael, I hope your weather is treating you well. And what an amazing place it is, particularly for academic research and scientific research around that entire Boston-Cambridge area. It's absolutely amazing. So, ladies and gentlemen, the time has just gone 8 o'clock. Danny Kadar, let's turn on, 8:30. Danny Kadar, let's turn on your camera. Wave to everyone. Danny is on control this evening. How was your Shabbos, Danny?
So fantastic. Caught up on reading and had a good Shabbos shlof. So I'm very well rested and ready to go, Howard.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for everything that you're doing for us tonight. This is webinar number 67. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And our final webinar of the year is in fact going to be tomorrow evening. And tomorrow evening we're having a communal Hanukkah lighting. And you'll see my Hanukkah lights are lit behind me over here. I hope the rest of you have all lit on your Hanukkah lights. Scott, don't set your house on fire there. And tomorrow evening at 5:30, we have Isaac Herzog, who is chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel and former leader of the Labour Party in Israel. He's joining us for candle lighting tomorrow. We also have Yair Lapid. And as many of you will know, Yair Lapid is the leader of the opposition in Israel. They'll be joining us, and we have the chief rabbi lighting some Hanukkah candles. We also have an amazing array of people like Chaya Singer and Sean Zaganov and other community leaders from around the place. Adina Roth, who will all be lighting Hanukkah candles with us. And Yudi Cohen will be, in fact, singing Mautzur and debuting a brand new single that he's just released with his son. So that's tomorrow, 5:30. Please join us for a communal Hanukkah candle lighting ceremony. And that will, in fact, be webinar number 68 for the year. And with that, we'll take a little bit of a break and send everyone on holiday. But I presume, Holiday Scott, are you going away, or are you staying fixed to your home behind locked bars and sanitizer?
Until the end of the year, we're staying at home, but hopefully early in the new year, we'll be able to go out by ourselves to some quiet place where we will not be raging or partying with other people.
I know your wife, and it must be hard to stop her from raging. And also,
that, yes.
A final reminder for those people who haven't seen the latest edition of the Jewish Report newspaper. It's, of course, headline is all about rage. And we know that, in fact, that was the cause of the major outbreak and the surge in infections within our community and within this general South African population. So if you haven't got your copy of the Jewish Report, please go on to www.sajr.co.za, download a full edition of the Jewish Report, or alternatively, pop into your local Dischem, Spar, Checkers, Woolworths, garage shop, pick up a copy of the Jewish Report. We're read on hard copy by about 34,000 people every week, and about another 30,000 people log onto our website every week to download a copy of the Jewish Report newspaper, and of them about 12,000 from around the world. So Marco, no excuse to not read the Jewish Report in North Carolina.
Thank you.
So the time is 8:34, and the people in Cape Town have 2 minutes before Shabbos goes out. Tonight, we have really gathered some of the world experts in DNA, and we're going to be discussing in 3 very distinct segments issues that affect us as with DNA. Scott's going to be taking us through a journey, a Jewish journey about Jewish DNA. What is the difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Mizrahi and Jews who come from India and Kaifon in China and the Lemba and the Ethiopians? Is DNA even a factor? Because Jews have never been a racially or a based religion at all. We've been subscribing to ideas, and we've been subscribing to a philosophy, and we've been living traditions, but we don't have our own color. We don't have our own race. And so is this even a question of relevance to us? So that's where we're going to start with Scott. Then we're going to move on to Danny, and Danny's going to be talking to us about health and what we can actually discover by analyzing our DNA, and what choices are we going to make in life because of what we know and understand based on our DNA. And Marco Weinberg is going to be joining us as well, and he's going to be talking about the latest developments in gene editing. Should we be worried about the fact that we've now developed the technology to go in and edit our DNAs, take out diseases, make ourselves potentially immune to cancer, maybe add a little bit of intelligence into our unborn children? All of that we're going to be discussing this evening. I hope it will be a discussion with you as well. So you will notice there are 2 buttons at the bottom of your screen. The one button says chat. Please feel free to chat to us as we go along. We'd love to actually see it. If you have any questions for the panel, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a comment section on YouTube where many hundreds of people are watching us on YouTube this evening. We have over 1,000 people busy watching us on Zoom currently, and many more people on YouTube as well. So we've got a wonderful audience. We think people are really engaged about the subject this evening. So to kick us off, I'm going to show you a very short video about DNA, and then we're going to start off our discussions.
I'm proud to be English. My family have served and we've defended this country and we've been to war for this country.
I'm really patriotic about Bangladesh.
Well, I am 100% Icelandic, yeah, definitely.
This is a Kurdish wedding with my mom in the traditional Kurdish clothes.
We're just proud black, so that's it.
Yeah, I think we are probably the best country in the world, if I'm honest.
Think about other countries and other nationalities in the world. Are there any that you don't feel you get on with well, or you won't like particularly?
Germany, yeah. I'm not a fan of the Germans.
You might think they're a little bit...
Particularly India and Pakistan, probably, because of the whole, the conflict.
Because I have this side of me that's like, that hates Turkish people. Not people, but the government.
But French?
Nah.
We're just the best, it's just fact.
I'm more important than you. I don't know you, but in my opinion, I am strong and I am more important than a lot of people.
How would you feel about taking a journey based on your DNA?
Yeah, I feel very intrigued.
What could you possibly tell me that I don't know?
So do you know how DNA works? So you get half from mum and half from dad, so 50% from each of them, and they get 50% from their parents, and back and back and back. And all those little bits of your ancestor, they filter down to make you, you. I need you to spit in this tube for me. You spit up to the little black line.
That's a lot of spit.
Right, the story of you is in that tube. What's it gonna tell me?
It's gonna be, oh yeah, you're French, and wait, your grandparents are French, and wait.
100% Bengali.
Solid Iraqi. I'm Cuban.
You're gonna tell me that I'm English, like I've told you.
Jay, you come down and join us?
I'm a little bit nervous, I have to say.
So you ready to find out your results? Will you read it out to us, please?
Wow, look at me.
Oh my God. Oh, wow. Shit, I didn't expect that.
All of them.
Whoa! No.
Caucasus, which was Turkish?
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece.
I'm 32% British.
What?
Great Britain, 30%. Can we 5% German?
I'm Irish.
Yeah.
So I'm a Muslim Jew.
Great Britain, 11%. Are you sure these results are mine?
Eastern Europe?
Iceland has definitely moved closer to Europe now.
I'm gonna go a bit far right now, but this should be compulsory. There would be no such thing as like extremism in the world if people knew their heritage like that. Like, who would be stupid enough to think of such thing as like a pure race?
In a way, we're all kind of cousins, in a broad sense. In a much more direct sense, you have a cousin in this room. Turn around and guess who it is.
You don't?
Wash?
What's that?
Why don't you come down here and meet your cousin?
God, this is the best.
Did you know that?
I didn't know I did. This is like, my heart's pounding right now, I swear to God. We met.
I'm Jay from everywhere, by the reason of this.
I'm a real man of the world.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you.
So would you like to travel to all of these places?
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Oh yeah.
Professor Scott Hazelhurst, what should we know about DNA?
I think that's a really nice introduction because it tells us that DNA is a very powerful way that we can use to tell us something about where we came from, but it doesn't define who we are. So you gave an introduction and you used the term Jewish DNA, and that's a term I really don't like, because DNA doesn't define if you're Jewish, it doesn't define if you're anything, it just tells us about where we came from. And as we saw in that very short introduction, many people have heritage that comes from all over the world. And I think those aren't the exceptions. I think it's true of most people, probably most people in this audience can trace their heritage back, or their ancestors back, to many different parts of the world.
So Scott, we all started somewhere in Africa, and we migrated, or many of us migrated into Europe. It's almost the pattern of the last 180,000 years of migration, is it not?
Correct. So about 70,000 years ago, modern humans left Africa. A small proportion of modern humans left Africa and settled the rest of the world in the next 40,000 years. Roughly about 20,000 years, 20 to 10,000 years ago, the people who settled in the broader Middle East and became the ancestors of the first Jews, the first Arabs, settled, and there's been a very complex history since then.
So Judaism isn't an ethnicity per se, because you can adopt the religion, you can convert into the religion. There were different times within the Jewish faith of how it was passed on. At some point in time, it was passed on through the father. At some point in time, it was passed on through the mother or the father. And it was only at the time of the Second Temple that we actually made a decision that it should be passed from the mother, or alternatively converted. But that having been said, there's still many commonalities that exist within the DNA when one examines the DNA of the Jewish people.
Yes, I think that's a very important lesson, and I think it's one that's quite interesting. So if I can just give a brief history lesson, I think the most important date in Jewish population history is 586 BCE, when the first temple fell, when the Babylonians defeated the kingdom of Judah. Because since that time, the majority of the Jewish peoples have lived outside of the historic land of Israel. And in fact, for the vast majority of time, the vast majority of Jews have lived outside of that area. They've lived in very different parts of the world, and so have been exposed to different environments. And most importantly, they've been exposed to different peoples with whom they interacted. So on the one hand, we see that interaction through different genetics. So people who went to live in Iran or in the Caucasus versus people who might have lived in, who then moved to parts of Europe or Africa, interacted with the neighboring people, and there definitely was a relatively large scale conversion at early stages in that history. And on the other hand, today, we can still see that there is commonality. So if we look at Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, we can see definite differences in the genetic makeup, but we can also see that there's commonality. And in fact, in some cases, there's more commonality between those Jewish groups than there is between the neighboring people in which they lived.
So just to understand that clearly, that means, for example, a Jewish community in Tunisia may have more in common with a Jewish community in Poland than it does to their neighboring communities in Tunisia.
Yes, I think at a crude level, yes. I think we're talking at the community level. Obviously, there's lots of variation within individual communities. And if you take the Tunisian community as an example, there's not just one type of Tunisian community. The Tunisian community at one stage was very large, and there was significant variations in that community.
So Scott, you in fact corrected me the other day, because I was talking about Ashkenazim and Sephardim as the two major groups within the Jewish community, but you said, I've got it completely wrong, and Sephardim is too broad a term. Explain to me what you mean by that.
Yes, so I think often today we use Sephardi as a shorthand for non-Ashkenazi. And perhaps that's because in Israel, there's a chief rabbi who's the Sephardic chief rabbi, who is responsible for non-Ashkenazi people inside Israel. But that in fact is not accurate. There are lots of different Jewish communities that have developed over the last 2,600 years. Some of them are very small and relatively exotic, but broadly we would divide Jews historically into three groups: the Ashkenazi, who lived in Europe, from France eastwards into Russia. The Sephardi Jews, who technically we mean those people who are descendants of those Jews who lived in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal before the expulsion from Spain. And then the Mizrahi Jews who lived in North Africa and eastwards into Iraq and what's nowadays Iran. And obviously those are not clear dividing lines, because there was always interaction and movement from one community to the other. But as a whole, the communities did not interact at a large scale. So we start to see from the time of the first temple onwards, and particularly after the fall of the second temple, we start to see divergence in those communities, both culturally, as you can see in religious practice, and genetically.
Is that because often men move and women stay, and men move to different places and adopt local wives? So
there were different population patterns at different times, depending on exactly what made the movement happen. And sometimes there was a sex balance when people moved as a whole. But we do see a pattern in many migrations, is that it's historically anyway, is that it was led by men, and only later did women follow. And so there was, at least in the first generations of large-scale population movement, there tended to be much more outmarriage of people marrying from outside the Jewish community into it and forming a new Jewish community.
So that having been said, is it easier to track the DNA of the Jewish people through the male or the female of the tribe?
Oh no, both. I think that's what's really interesting about it. So you want to use all the DNA. In fact, we use the DNA. The most important DNA is the DNA that's neither maternal or paternal specific. The 22, what we call the 22 autosomal chromosomes, which is about 92% of all our DNA. And that's the most important to understand our history. But using the mitochondrial DNA, which we inherit from our mothers, so maternally only, and the Y chromosome, which men have and inherit from their fathers, is very useful because it allows us to understand something about the population history. So if we see a difference, a sex difference, which we often do in Jewish communities in terms of who the founders were, that tells us something really interesting about how that community came into being. And of course, within the Jewish community historically, there has been a caste system. So we have a caste system among the Cohenim and the Leviim, which is passed down strictly paternally. And we can use the DNA to tell us something about that caste system.
So tell us about the caste system. Is there a Cohen gene?
No, so I think that's a very important, an important point to make, is there's no such thing as a Cohen gene. Let me talk a little bit about the Y chromosome, which men have. It's just under 5% of the entire genome. So it's not a lot. And because it's inherited strictly on the paternal line, my Y chromosome, for example, looks pretty much like what the Y chromosome of my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather looked like. And so any 6 cousins that I have that also are on the male line will have Y chromosomes that look something like mine. So if we try to understand what's happened in a population's history, and we see that within that particular community, there are shared Y chromosomes, and the jargon that's sometimes used, and I'm going to use it because I think people who are interested in this will have come across it, as a haplogroup. If we see shared haplogroups within a community, it tells us something about that. And so if we look at all these Y haplogroups that exist, it turns out that there are certain Y haplogroups that are particularly overrepresented in particular communities. So we see on the whole that, say, Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews will tend to have Y chromosomes that look like this. And within the caste system, we see that the Cohenim actually share many haplogroups together. And maybe I could just share something on the screen just to illustrate it, if I can find it quickly. Sorry, I thought I had it here. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost it. I'll just carry on. I thought I had a picture to show you. So what we see is that there are these haplogroups that are particularly overrepresented among the Cohenim. And that's very strong evidence that this caste system that existed in First and Second Temple times has continued and been maintained quite effectively until today. So we see, for example, about 50% of Cohenim have a particular haplogroup called JP51. And I think that's a really interesting thing about the being able to maintain particular cultural traditions over a 2,000-year period.
So just to understand you fully, while you're saying there's no Cohen gene, there is a predominance of certain characteristics that are found in about 50% of all Kohanim.
So we see particular mutations that are found in most Kohanim, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic. But of course, about 50% of Kohanim don't have those mutations.
So now, Scott, we spoke about three big groups: Ashkenazim, Mizrahi, and Sephardim. But of course, there are other Jewish groups at all. They're Ethiopian Jews, and they're Indian Jews, and they're Chinese Jews who come from Kaifeng. Is there commonality between all of their genetics?
So among the Ethiopian Jews, who have a very old history going back probably over 2,000 years, the genetic studies that have been done haven't been able to find that particular marker of similarity of people who could trace their ancestry back to people who lived in the area around what we nowadays call the Levant. So that Levant would be among Ethiopians, haven't found a strong link back there. There are complications there because the Ethiopians, there are many Semitic people who live in Ethiopia, and that does make some of the analysis much more difficult. Among the Indian Jews, there are actually several Indian groups. Some are relatively recent, the so-called Baghdadi Jews, who basically came with the British, who were Mizrahi in origin. But the more interesting ones, I think, are the Bnei Israel and the Cohen Jews, who I think are quite well known. And maybe I could just share, if I've got 2 minutes on this.
Sure, absolutely. So many of the original Jewish community in Kochi in India, now called Cochin, there were about 30 or 40,000 Jews, Bnei Israel, in the Kochi area.
Yes, that's about that. So what we have is in particularly in this area in the can you see the picture?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So in this area over here, the Baghdadi Jews, who tended to be upper class, came in the 19th century. Some very wealthy families like the Sassoons and the Kaduris settled there. But what I think is more interesting is these areas here on the west coast. So in the Cochin area down in the south, and then this area just south and east of Bombay, the so-called Bnei Israel, a smaller group of people. So it seems from both oral history and confirmed, although the dates are different from the genetic studies that have been done, is there were, in fact, in Cochin, 2 waves of migration. One roughly 1,500 years ago, so quite a long time ago, and then one about 400 or 500 years ago, maybe as a result of the expulsion from Spain, but probably, but that history isn't very well known.
Of course, there is a link because Goa, which is just north of the state of Kerala, was in fact a Portuguese colony.
Yes,
so
yes,
there may very well have been people who fled at the time of the Inquisition and went to the Portuguese colony of Goa.
Yes. I mean, there certainly were cases like that, and of course that was a different and quite a hard history, because in Goa the Inquisition actually did follow people later on. But certainly that could have been where people came, and I think had a happier time in Cochin than in Goa. So there were this quite varied Jewish community in Cochin. And what we see there is that there's definitely evidence that the founders of that community were from the Levant. So from probably, whether it was Sephardic or Ashkenazim or Mizrahi, we can't tell, but definitely from the Levant. And there is evidence that there's a sex imbalance there, so that the founders of that community were predominantly, but maybe not only, men. Then further north in this area over here, in the 19th century, up until actually after the foundation of the State of Israel, there were people who lived in this quite wide area in India. A much smaller community, maybe 10 to 20,000 people in the 19th century, and spread over quite a wide area called the Bnei Israel. And they probably settled in India about 1,000 years ago. Again, there's lots of, both in the Cochin and in the Bnei Israel, there was a lot of intermarriage with Indian people. So the overwhelming majority of the DNA of those Jews is Indian in origin, but there's definite evidence that there were founders from a Levantine origin. And again, that there's a sex imbalance, so that we see, as in other Jewish migrations, that the founders were predominantly men.
And Scott, what do we know about the Jews of China, the Jews who came from Kaifeng?
So I don't know a lot about it myself, and I've looked for the studies that have been done, genetic studies, and I haven't found any. So I can't help you with that. Sorry, Howard.
So tradition has it that in fact Persian Jews traveling to China in fact started the community in Kaifeng, but of course ethnically they look completely Chinese.
Yes. I mean, so you might know that in the period from the 7th to the 10th centuries, there was a very powerful kingdom north of the Black Sea called the Khazarian Kingdom, and that was right on the trade route, that controlled the trade route from Europe to China. So that I know there's been speculation that might have been another source of the Chinese Jewish population, is that there were these Khazarians who might have been traveling as part of that route.
Scott, is there anything else on the slide that you want to show us, or shall we stop sharing the screen?
I think I'll stop sharing the screen at that point.
So Scott, I want to talk about Ashkenazim, because most of the South African Jewish community come from Eastern Europe. So we presume that most of our ancestors were in the area of Israel until the fall of the Second Temple. What can we learn? What happened to us after that? So
in fact, I would say we really don't know what you've just said, because we know that from the start of the Second Temple times, there was a very large Jewish diaspora right across the Mediterranean. And so by the start of the 1st century CE, that is before the fall of the Second Temple, there was, for example, in Rome, it's estimated there was a Jewish community of about 50,000 in size. So that's probably, in terms of Rome at that stage was probably as Jewish as Johannesburg is today. So we don't know anything really about where the Ashkenazim came from. So to be an expert on the history of the Ashkenazim before the 10th century is actually quite easy, because there really is very little known about the Ashkenazim before the 10th century. So the genetic evidence that we have now tends to imply that there was a wave of migration, first from the land of Israel to Italy, which was predominantly men, but not only. And then there was a wave of admixture with Southern Europeans. And if we look at Ashkenazim today, on average, about 25% of the DNA of Ashkenazim comes from Southern Italian origin. And then later on, that community is, like we think, moved up to the area of what we now call the Rhineland, Eastern France, Western Germany, at about the beginning of the 10th century. And certainly by the end of the 10th century, there's a very vibrant Jewish community. That's the time of Rashi, for example. And then there's a smaller admixture events at that point, where there's intermingling with Western Europeans. And then as a result of persecution, of Christian persecution, the community moves eastwards by the 16th century to Poland and eastwards. And then there's another admixture event of about 15%. So the best estimates today that on average, Ashkenazim of about a 45 to 50% Levantine, Middle Eastern origin, and 50% European in origin, which is spread predominantly Southern European, Eastern European, and a little bit of Western European.
Scott, I'm going to show you a 2-minute video, and then after that, we're going to come back and discuss my personal DNA results, which I'm going to share with everyone. So let's watch this.
Today is a potentially confusing day, but mostly it's exciting. I'm 99.7% Ashkenazi Jewish. Oh my God. I'm the Jewiest person anyone knows. I mean, whatever it is the Jews were chosen for, I've got it. Mostly it's heart disease and anxiety. 0.2% British and Irish. Hello! I am 0.1% broadly European. I'm gonna say that the broadest part of me is my hips, and I'm blaming Europe for that. There is a way, based on your DNA from your mom, that they can literally trace the migration patterns of where your family went and how many years ago they went there. So we start in East Africa 180,000 years ago. And then it looks like my line branched out, wow, to modern day Saudi Arabia, modern day Iran, and then up into the Caspian Sea. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. One of the things that Jewish people all over the world tend to reflect on as the Jewish holidays are now is our connection to a larger Jewish identity and what that means for our significance in the world. And learning this information at a time of year when I'm focusing so much on my spiritual identity and my connection to the Jewish community, even if I wasn't 99.7% Ashkenazi Jewish, having concrete information and being able to see that there's a whole world of people out there that I'm connected to is really, really special. And also just knowing that there's a place where we can actually get this kind of information, like this is where science has led us to.
So, of course, that is Mayim Bialik, who many people will know maybe originally from Blossom or now as Sheldon's girlfriend in The Big Bang Theory. But guys, to all of our guests, I am now going to share with you my personal DNA results. So forgive me. But if you thought Mayim Bialik was Jewish, I suppose I'm not far behind. So I've had my DNA tested through 23andMe, and I've also uploaded it into MyHeritage. And according to 23andMe, I'm 99.7% European, of which 98.9% is Ashkenazi. and 0.8% North European. And I have a little traces of some obscure Scandinavian bits in me as well. Does that surprise any of you? Is that very Jewish?
Very.
So I want to say, sorry, Scott.
I mean, I think that's what I would just like to add to that is that when you say Ashkenazi Jewish, I think that is a very broad category. So within Ashkenazi Jewish is quite a wide variety. So first of all, there's quite wide diversity in Ashkenazi Jewish because it's a mixture of two different groups, a Middle Eastern group and a European group. And secondly, over a 1,000-year period, the Ashkenazi community lived in a very wide area from France in the west right through to deep into Russia and south into Russia. So there's quite a wide diversity among Ashkenazi Jewish, and some recent studies have come out that have analyzed this in some detail.
So Scott, I want to know how accurate this is, because when I take that exact DNA and upload it to MyHeritage, it comes out with slightly different results. There they tell me I'm 95.2% Ashkenazi Jewish, but also 4% North African Sephardi Jewish.
Yes, so I think the two reasons why you're seeing that is that these different databases, the way in which these numbers come, is that generally we compute this by looking at your DNA and using existing reference populations as proxies for people who lived in the past. So we take a group of 100 people who live in Tuscany, and we say these people are a proxy for who lived 2,000 years ago in the past. If another company takes another group of 100 Italians as their proxy, they're going to have a different reference database. The second reason why you're seeing this is that the algorithms that make these computations are statistical in nature, and they look for the best models that explain your DNA based on these proxy populations that we have. And because they're statistical, or the word we will use is stochastic in nature, is there might be multiple competing models that all explain your DNA reasonably well. And some of these algorithms actually use random number generators at different parts. And so if you run the same algorithm again, you might come up with a slightly different answer. So my response to you would be that those very small percentages are probably, you need to look at very circumspectly. So if you're seeing 1% Swedish, I wouldn't give any, wouldn't worry about that one way or the other. And I would say that there's a lot of congruence between those two figures that you see.
I was blaming my tall blonde looks on that, Scott.
Yes,
there goes that.
Yes,
But also the interesting thing that comes out in all of this is your ability to find relatives. So for example, my closest relative on myheritage.com, I've never met. I have no idea who this person is. There's someone called Izzy Zach, age 80, somewhere in the United States, but I have no idea. But we share more DNA than my closest cousins in South Africa.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting and very powerful application. Can be positive, it can be negative, depending on who you find and what you know about the people. So one of the studies that one of the postdocs in our lab was involved with about 5 years ago was a large study based on data from the UK Biobank. And in that study, for example, they found a number of individuals who turned out to be products of incestuous marriages. And when you find that sort of relative information, you can see that can be very damaging to individuals if people don't know that sort of history. So issues around paternity and problems in the family can come out when you use DNA for this. So I think it's something that if you are going to be using one of those sites, you need to understand the risks of doing so. I know I've got my own DNA up there, and I've met a number of people through that, and it's been a very positive experience. But you need to be aware of the risk. And I think Marco was wanting to say something.
Yeah, there are two other examples I can think of, Scott. One is where criminals have been identified this way, and you may be, in fact, a conspirator in identifying relatives who are criminals. And the other example is where you may actually have a disease predisposition which only manifests later in your life, which you find out about, or you find out that your relatives may have that predisposition. So quite tough information to disseminate.
So we're going to talk about disease in a few minutes together with Danny. But Scott, can we ask you, let's do some very quick questions that have come in from members of the audience under our Q&A section. And let's see if we can give some very quick answers to that as well. Harry Friedland says, what are the chances that the lost tribes could be found amongst the Arabs and Palestinians?
I think low at this point, because I think a lot of studies have been done, and I think we really don't know what happened under, we talk about the lost tribes, you're talking about the Assyrian defeat of the Kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE. And what happened to those people, we don't know. So we were fortunate that under the Babylonian conquest, the people were able to keep an identity for 70 years before they were able to return. And that wasn't the case with the Assyrians. So I think the chances are very low.
Bernard Glass says, does a brother and sister have the same DNA?
You share 50% of your DNA with your brother or sister.
Stephen
So
Marks,
yeah.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Stephen Marks asks, Ashkenazi link to the Khazars. Are the Ashkenazim Khazarian converts?
So that's an interesting question, and it's one that's been explored in great detail, and it's worthy of a discussion in its own right. But the answer, I would say, is no, and that is the overwhelming consensus among population geneticists in this area. So the Khazars were historically existed. They were a powerful Jewish kingdom north of the Black Sea, but they are highly unlikely to be the ancestors of the Khazars. The genetic evidence is very strong. The Ashkenazim are the descendants of people who moved to Italy and then moved into Western Europe and then later Eastern Europe.
So, Scott, a number of questions, and this is the last question we're going to ask you until a little later on in the program, but a lot of questions have come in from Matlodi, from Esther, about the Lemba. Has sufficient research been done with the Lemba community to determine ethnicity and origin?
I would say the short answer is probably no. And I want to preface this by saying it's a complex question. And again, that DNA does not define who we are. I think who you are and your identity of who you are comes from inside of you and from your community, not from some arbitrary biological facts. So there has been work that's been done on Lemba DNA. A lot of it has been done by one of my colleagues at WITS, Professor Sudial. And what that shows is that, so first of all, the Lemba people are Bantu-speaking people who live in the northern parts of South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and parts of Malawi. And there's a fair amount of variation within the Lemba people in terms of religion and cultural practice. It's not an area that I know much about, but I know that there is variation. But there certainly are people, Lemba people, who see themselves as Jewish or having a Jewish heritage. What the DNA shows, the latest research on DNA shows, is that there's very strong evidence that there's a founder of men who moved from the Arabian Peninsula down into Africa and then eastwards and southwards into Southern Africa. So there's a lot of there's a lot of the haplogroups among the men in Lemba, the Lemba men, which have that commonality of people who lived in the Arabian Peninsula, say 2,000 years ago. What the historical significance of that, Of course, we don't know. We do know, for example, that before the rise of Islam, there were a number of very powerful Jewish communities and kingdoms that lived in the Arabian Peninsula. So Judaism was a major religion in that area before the rise of Islam. So one can speculate then about who these people were and what they brought with them.
So I know Ethel Phillips, who's a member of the Lemba community, is a very regular watcher of our webinars, and I've promised her that we will in fact do a Lemba webinar in the new year as well. So Scott, I certainly hope you can help us on that. And I see Jeannie Rudolph has actually posted that Dr. Margaret Nabarro wrote her PhD on the Lemba community and music. Lots of questions coming in. Last one from you before we speak to Danny about health, and that is one question that's come in the chat rather in the Q&A, and I please ask you to put all your questions into the Q&A button or into the comments on YouTube. But identical twins, what is the DNA issue with identical twins? Do they have an identical DNA pattern?
The short, simple answer is yes.
Okay. Good enough short answer. We're going to come back to you because there's so many questions that people want to ask you, Scott. So we're going to come back to you shortly. And Danny, just before we begin speaking to you, I just want to show people a very short video about what we can actually understand about our health and DNA.
At-home DNA tests can now tell you how likely you are to develop everything from heart disease to cancer. 23andMe allows you to learn about your health using just your saliva.
Our genetic health risk reports can tell you if you have a variant that puts you at a higher risk of developing a disease.
We opened our results and found 3 things in common.
Age-related macular degeneration.
Age-related macular degeneration. And then this is celiac disease.
Celiac disease, and then type 2 diabetes, which also does run in my family.
Type 2 diabetes.
Turns out I've got an increased likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes, which actually doesn't surprise me because diabetes runs in my family. But as comprehensive as these tests are, Cintron stresses,
we're not a diagnostic service, so we're not telling you if you're going to get the disease or even if you have it.
It clearly states our tests do not diagnose any health conditions. But how accurate are they?
I think they're accurate in what they're designed to pick up.
Kim Brousseau is a certified genetic counselor for the University of Arizona Cancer Center at Dignity Health. She says these tests should never replace seeing your doctor.
Even if somebody is positive, it doesn't mean they will develop that disease.
But there were also some interesting surprises for all of us in our traits reports.
Ice cream flavor preference. It said that people with my genetics favor chocolate over vanilla, which is 100% true.
Likely at least a little unibrow. Well, does it look like I have a unibrow? I don't think so. More likely to have stretch marks? What the heck?
What I do like about this is that it gives you a health action plan, and when you click on it, it actually gives you ways on how to manage and reduce your risk.
Is this
So Danny, you run a business called D-Analytics, is that correct?
Close. How you've only had a week to practice it. D-Analysis.
D-Analysis, sorry, forgive me. And in fact, I'm a customer. I went to you and I did a whole battery of tests. And what can we learn by actually having our DNA analyzed today?
Well, Howard, as you saw from that video clip, I mean, there's a fortune of information that we can learn. What we're very much interested in are those health markers that are modifiable with the right lifestyle or dietary or medical intervention. So, yeah, there's sort of the nice curiosities maybe about a preference for ice cream flavor, but you've got to wonder whether he actually preferred chocolate before we got the results of his test or not. So we're looking at risk factors for generally your chronic diseases of lifestyle, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity risk, certain cancers, where the one thing that we put a big emphasis on is as again was mentioned in the video, identifying these markers doesn't mean that you're going to get the disease. They are risk factors that should be seen as empowering information to the consumer or to the patient, because there are always interventions that can be made in order to try and reduce the disease risk. One thing that we put a big emphasis on is we do these tests within the context of a clinical practice. So we don't sell direct to consumer at all. We believe that you're sitting there with a doctor, with a dietitian, they're going to have a lot more information about you than what we're going to have from just the genetic test. And really to do a holistic health assessment, put the test result into the context of who you are, what do they know about you, about your family history, about your lifestyle. All of that adds up to give you a good health roadmap for looking after yourself and ensuring good health outcomes.
So let us presume I have my DNA analyzed and it says I have a propensity to diabetes. Does it necessarily mean that I'm going to get diabetes?
It definitely doesn't. It definitely doesn't. That's, I think, one of the key findings from the results of the Human Genome Project, where there was a time when we felt that our genes very much determined our outcomes, that the genes we had, that was the cards that we've been dealt, and there was not much we could do to change the outcomes or the destiny that we were dealt. And now we realize that there's a very, very strong interaction between the genes that you have and the lifestyle that you lead, the choices that you make, the environment in which you place those genes. And so two people with completely different lifestyles, or different, one might be a sedentary couch potato who never does any exercise and is overweight and smokes and drinks. Another person could be an elite athlete. They could have very, very similar genetics and very similar risk for type 2 diabetes, but the chance of the disease actually manifesting would be far greater in the couch potato. So what we do is the results of the test can encourage somebody to motivate somebody to change their lifestyle, adopt the healthiest habits in order to try and reduce the disease risks that we identify.
So what are the diseases today that we can identify and do something about?
So some of the big ones are your chronic disease of lifestyle. You're looking at certain cancers such as breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. We really look at tests across the health spectrum. The vast majority of chronic diseases, these are diseases that place a massive burden on the healthcare system. And the vast majority of them are lifestyle related and largely preventable if you adopt the correct habits and the right nutrition patterns, the right lifestyle habits. The vast majority of these are largely preventable. So, these tests are, to my mind, they're there to encourage people to take more responsibility for their own health, to not wait to get sick and rely on a healthcare system to try and make them better, to try and rely on a doctor to cure them when they are sick. Really, people should be starting to take more responsibility for their own health and ensuring, taking control of ensuring their own health outcomes.
So there's been a lot of talk about diet and DNA. How are the two linked?
I think generally what's happened is we've moved away from this one-size-fits-all model of healthcare, be it risk for disease, be it diet, low fat, low carb, Banting, whatever the different fad diet might be. The reality is that there's no single dietary intervention that is going to work for every single person. I think go back 10, 15 years, if a person who's overweight went to a dietitian, they'd go into a traditional low-fat diet, and if after 4-6 weeks that person wasn't losing weight, the only possible explanation was that they were cheating. And now we know that different people respond differently. So some people might do much better on a low-fat diet. Some people would do better on a low-carbohydrate diet. There are those people where the diet type is not that important. If they're not doing high-intensity exercise, they're simply not going to lose weight. So, it's this whole field of personalized medicine, whether it's weight management, whether it's prescription medication. Every person is an individual, and every person with the use of genetics, a doctor has insight into treating them as an individual rather than this one-size-fits-all approach.
So one of the key things that I walked away from having my analysis done at you was almost a list to give to my doctors of these are drugs I should never ever get. These are drugs I should get with caution. These are drugs that freely my doctor can prescribe to me. Is that kind of a standard thing today? And is the science on that evolving all the time?
The field you're talking about is it's called pharmacogenetics, which it looks at the genes that we carry and how the genes that we carry, which code for the drug metabolizing enzymes, work. So different people will metabolize drugs at a different speed. You get the fast metabolizers, you get slow metabolizers. It's the kind of thing where conceptually, I'm sure everyone listening has had this experience or this conversation in a group of friends where somebody will complain of a headache and the person will say, you know, Panado, I take Panado, it puts me to sleep. Another person will say, well, I can take, 10 Panado and it doesn't touch sides. And the reality is we now understand the rationale for this at a genetic level, where we have genetic differences in the genes that make these drug metabolizing enzymes, these proteins that break down the drugs. And so we respond to them differently. And you say, is it routine? Well, it's not yet routine. I think it's certainly becoming more routine. I'm sure certainly in the States, there are hospitals where they won't prescribe a single drug until they've looked at your pharmacogenomics report. It's something that is becoming more common in South Africa. But the science is robust. The science is very, very robust to support it. I mean, I could tell a story about my wife when she had our second child, and she developed a venous sinus thrombosis after the Caesar, and she went into a dose of warfarin. And warfarin, people know, is a particularly difficult drug to get the dosage correct. It requires regular blood tests to make sure that the dose is right and that the blood is not too clotted or sort of not clotted enough. And for 8 weeks, she did not respond to the warfarin, and they kept increasing the dose for 8 weeks. She was walking around with essentially a clot in her brain and not responding to the warfarin. And eventually they changed the drug and she responded immediately. And at the time, we didn't have the test in the lab. We got into the lab about 6 months or so later, and she was one of the first people I tested. And sure enough, it said that she was not going to respond well to warfarin and would need a much higher starting dose. So that is the kind of potentially life-saving information that should be absolutely standard for anybody to have. The list of drugs that are covered by the test are increasing all the time. So it's cardiovascular medications, it's psychiatric medication, and many people listening will know how hard it is to get onto the right drug from a psychiatric perspective, be it antidepressants, mood stabilizers. The psychiatrists are largely working in the dark when they have to get the right drug at the right dosage. So this is just a tool that can really help the doctor to get the patient on the right track, the right therapeutic level of a medication in the shortest possible time.
So Marco, I know our friend Musa, one of the things that he was working on, and for the Lemba community who are watching us, Musa is partly Lemba as well, but one of the things that he was working on was to try to predict what cancer medication would actually respond best to your personalized type of cancer that you have.
Right. I mean, it all, again, speaking to what Danny has said, it all depends on what type of resistance markers you have. In other words, certain treatments actually do not work at all based on whether or not those drugs actually interact correctly with the receptors that are available. So again, a test in the form of a pharmacogenomic-like test can provide a lot of information as to whether or not a particular type of drug will work. And we now know, for example, Herceptin positive versus negative cancers. These tests are now routine for many different types of cancers.
So I don't know what's happening in the United States, but Danny, maybe we can compare between the United States and South Africa. If someone is diagnosed with cancer, are we doing these sorts of tests to look at the different chemotherapies to see which chemotherapy would be most effective in treating a cancer? Marco, is that now common practice in the United States?
I think so, yeah.
And Danny, in South Africa, have we seen that evolve yet?
Certainly. So with certain cancers, yes. And Marco mentioned Herceptin. That's certainly one cancer that would get tested. I think the complexity with cancers is you're looking at genetics on two levels. You're looking at the genetics of the individual and how they're going to metabolize the drug, and then you're looking at the link between the drug and that particular tumor. So you've got gene expression within the tumor and how that responds to the drug. So it is a little bit more complex when it comes to the cancer medications. But certainly there are tests that are being done where possible in South Africa. It is starting to get used more routinely.
So someone anonymous has asked, can you test yet for Alzheimer's?
There are genetic risk markers for Alzheimer's. There's a test that we do. Yes, it's not diagnostic. It doesn't mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's. Like many of these, it confers an increased risk. But I referred earlier to the term modifiable risk factors, that even with a genetic predisposition to something like Alzheimer's, there are certain interventions that can be made that will help to reduce that risk. So these are not diagnostic, they're not deterministic tests. Having the genetic markers come up does not mean that the disease will manifest.
So let's talk about some of the Jewish diseases. The BRCA gene seems to be a very common one resulting in breast cancer. I presume we can test for that today.
Yeah, you can certainly test for BRCA. What people might not know is that it's only a small minority of breast cancers that are due to the BRCA gene mutation. So we talk about high penetrance versus low penetrance gene mutations, and what that means is the likelihood of the disease manifesting if you have the genetic mutation. So something like BRCA is high penetrance, which means if you have the mutation, there's quite a high chance that you will end up getting breast cancer. I don't know the exact percent. I think it's approximately 70 to 80% likelihood of the disease manifesting if you do have the BRCA gene. But it's probably only 10% of all breast cancers that are caused by the BRCA gene mutation. So even though it's sort of got the bad name and people know the BRCA gene, we're talking about 90% of breast cancers are not a result of the BRCA gene mutation.
So let's talk about some of the other things that afflict Jews. One of the comments that people always tell me is that if you don't have an intolerance to dairy, then you can't really be Ashkenazi.
Well, I mean, Howie, I think with all these things, whether it's your irritable bowel, your lactose sensitivity, I think gluten as well is one of those where the Jewish population is, I'm not sure Professor Hazelhurst will be better placed to maybe give the exact term. I'm tempted to say inbred, but I don't think that that's the right terminology to use necessarily. But it's a very homogeneous population. And so if you have, these genetic-based diseases, they will get passed down from generation to generation, and the percentage of people with the diseases will be quite high within a given population.
Another question that's come in: Can
I
you look
respond,
at?
Howard,
Scott.
Can I just respond to that?
Please.
I think there's two things. The one point I want to make is about lactose, is that the ability to digest milk beyond childhood is something that developed in European and certain European and African populations. And the fact that many Ashkenazim are unable to tolerate lactose is an indication that there is a non-European ancestry among the Ashkenazim. Around inbreeding, actually, it turns out that the Ashkenazim are not particularly inbred. So there is, the belief that in the shtetl everyone married their second cousins. And that, of course, is partially true, but it's actually true in world history until quite recently that was the case. The real source of what we see as the genetic burden of disease among Ashkenazim is an event that happened about 800 years ago called a population bottleneck. Why it happened, we don't know. We assume it's because of terrible persecution, but there was a dramatic drop in the population size in the Ashkenazim about 800 years ago. And so the population dropped to a very small level. The exact numbers we can't be sure of. And then you get what's called founder effect, is that those but those genetic diseases that happen to be common in that group of people then becomes common in the whole population as the population grows larger. And that's where this genetic burden of disease comes from in Ashkenazi. Well, that's the latest thinking anyway.
Okay, so Danny, if we can go back to a few more questions. Donna Druin says, will my medical aid cover this testing?
No, most likely not. Working on it.
Okay, another question. Can DNA analysis test for acne and other skin diseases?
There are certain genetic markers that can be looked at that look at things, at skin health. So yes, there's certain things that we can look at.
So very important question that's come in from someone, and they said, to tell someone that they have a BRCA disease is a very traumatic, or BRCA gene is a very traumatic thing to do. What is the level of counseling that takes place when someone gets their DNA results?
Well, I mean, so we don't test the BRCA gene ourselves. When BRCA testing is done, it is accompanied with with talking to a genetic counselor. I mean, we mentioned earlier, yes, some of the information that is revealed by these tests, whether it's the ancestry test or these types of health tests, this is significant information that people should be prepared how to handle. You sort of have to learn to take the good with the bad and make sure that you really want the information that you're going to be getting. So there's certainly genetic counseling involved if you're doing something like a BRCA test. When you're doing the tests that are more lifestyle related, there are some companies that do those direct to consumer. I don't think it's the right way to do it. I always think that there should be some level of counseling. We just do it through healthcare practitioners as opposed to a genetic counselor.
So Danny,
sorry, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I just wanted to follow up on that. I think that's really crucial because there are lots of companies that do offer direct to consumer advice on lifestyle and even on disease. And I think it's wicked. And you should use a service where you get either as Danny does or through a genetic counselor. And if you are going to get your DNA checked, don't use a service that's going to give you medical feedback unless there's counseling.
So Danny, very quickly, can we look at some of the results that I got from you, and maybe you can just explain very briefly some of them. So explain what we're looking at. My DNA sport results here.
So we did your DNA sport test. How are we trying to work out how it is that you're the elite athlete that you are, or maybe why you're not the elite athlete? But the test covers different areas. We're looking at certain genes known to be associated with Achilles tendinopathies. A lot of that research, funny enough, done by an academic down in Cape Town. So we're looking at risk for soft tissue injury, risk for things like Achilles tendinopathies. We look at, in terms of recovery, everyone, when they exercise, there's an inflammatory response. You have oxidative stress happening within the cells, and people take different amounts of time to recover from high intensity exercise. And it's certainly a Johannesburg problem. I think Johannesburg, maybe South Africa, there's a mentality with training that more must be better, where the trainers today, the more sophisticated trainers, will now tell you that the time away from training is as important as the time that you spend at training. So giving your body time to recover, making sure that you're prepared for your next high intensity exercise session.
So this is also telling me, if I pop a little further down, that I'm not built for endurance.
Correct. In terms of power and endurance potential, you're more on the power side.
Okay. And caffeine metabolism, does that mean I get jittery from coffee or not?
So there are genes that look at that. What we're looking at here specifically is, there's often caffeine supplements are taken in order to aid training. So it's the ergogenic effect of caffeine. We're saying that you're a fast metabolizer. So if you are going to use caffeine, it should be either just before a race or during a race, and not too far in advance, because you're going to lose the benefit of taking in that caffeine. Just to make a point, again, it comes down to the manner in which these tests are explained and some of the ethical elements associated with a test like this. the last thing we want is for people to take a test like this and push their children into playing a particular sport, or think that we're looking at talent identification or anything like that. And it's a question we get asked all the time. You know, can you tell me if my son's going to be a first-team rugby player, or should he go swimming, or whatever it might be? And you know, again, it's just a guide. It's just looking at if you're training. Once you're in your chosen sport, once you know what you enjoy, which is first and foremost the most important thing, and generally when you're going through the school system, the sport that you enjoy are the ones that you're good at. When you start specializing, when you start taking sport a little bit more seriously, rather than being out there doing the same thing, the same training as everybody else, we can start seeing what is going to work best for you. How can you optimize the time that you spend training in order to get maximum benefit from that time? So that's sort of the nature of the test that we're looking at there.
Okay, very, very quickly, let's run through this. Detoxification, identified that I don't produce enzymes that help in the detoxification of my body. I need to supplement. Is that correct?
Yeah, so detoxification is a critical process that happens in the liver. It's how we take in foreign substances, how we break it down through processes called phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. And there are key enzymes that play a role in taking these foreign substances, metabolizing them, and making sure that they're properly cleared from the body. We look at the enzymes that function within these pathways, and we're sort of assigning impact there. So if you look at one of the big ones, the GST-M1 there, you've got a deletion, which is pretty common in the population. About 50% of people have a deletion in that enzyme. That means that you've got about 50% of the functioning capacity of that enzyme. And so if you go back to things like your RDAs, your recommended daily allowance for nutrients, and you're told you need to take 400 micrograms of folate, but in actual fact, your enzyme's functioning at only 50%, then we can start saying, well, 400 micrograms is not going to be nearly enough for you. You need to take
that's kind of the choice I need to make. So you also on weight, you're telling me I'm fat by choice rather than by genes.
I'm trying to have a quick look here and see if you've got any genetic excuses. It looks to me, I mean, you lost a fortune of weight after doing this test, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
So obviously no genetic barriers for you to overcome, or you were told to do something differently. Maybe you can share your experience, because everyone told me how amazing this test was after you'd done it.
So last thing you identified for me gluten intolerance.
Yeah,
which I had no idea about before.
And something that is fairly common, as you mentioned, especially in some of the Jewish populations.
So, Danny, there's so many questions that are coming in for you, and we're going to come back to try and answer as many as we can towards the end of tonight. But people want to know where they can be tested by you, how they can do it. Can I ask you into the chat section? You don't do heritage, is that correct? You just do medical.
We've recently launched an ancestry test. We're collaborating with a group out of Portugal who are assisting us because they specialize in a lot of the African population genetics. So we do have an ancestry test. I'll put our web address into the chat, and and people can take a look at the website for more information. As I said, we don't sell these direct to consumer. So really what you're going to do on our website is find one of our healthcare practitioners that have gone through our training, and you would contact them to arrange to get the testing done through them.
So is there a list of healthcare practitioners on your website who are trained that are using your tests?
Yeah, exactly.
Danny, if I could ask you to put all the information now into the chat section, and also to look at some of the questions that have come in while you've been chatting, and we're going to come back to you to try and answer some of those questions a little later on. Scott, Ancestry you can also do at WITS through the what's the center called at WITS?
The Origin Center.
The Origin Center.
So there are a number of tests. So I think have a look at what Danny does, have a look at the Origins, and then ask the question what you want to find from it. And then you can choose what's the appropriate test for you to do.
And there are also some international ones, which are primarily heritage based. There's 23andMe. When you spit into a test tube, you send it back to America. I showed you some of my results. There's My Heritage. There are lots of them on the web.
Correct.
People can go search for them.
And I think the important thing is that you understand what you're getting and you understand what the pros and cons of them are. And as I say, I would discourage people from using a service that gives you back directly medical results without appropriate medical or genetic counseling results. I think it's dangerous.
Marco, have you ever been tested your own DNA?
Not for ancestry or genetic testing. No, I haven't, Howie. Yeah.
But
I'm a little bit, I guess what the issue is, the ancestry I'm going to know about is really quite far away in the past. I don't think we're looking at anything like my great-grandfather or his or her, his family. So we really are looking at the population migration and movements that have occurred in my history. So for that, I think I know that I'm half Italian and half Ashkenazi. So I have those kind of heritage, but well, maybe soon, sometime in the future, I'll figure it out and go get the test done.
I can tell you that there were 4 of us who tested together, and one friend of mine who's Muslim, and he said, no, I'm coming back 100% North Indian, Southern Pakistani. And the results came back and he had a little bit of Congolese, some Italian, some German, a little bit of English. And he goes to his mother and says, can you please explain this to me? You know, we're Muslim Indian. How did this happen? And her response was, well, actually, your grandfather was adopted, and we never really knew 100% that he was Jewish, that he was Indian. So you know, there are always surprises in some of our heritage. But we're going to be talking about the latest developments in terms of gene editing, and we've got a 2-minute video just to watch about CRISPR, and then we're going to come back and talk about what is possible and what is fantasy in where we are at the moment.
Let's talk about genes. No, not those. Those. Genes determine our traits, like eye color and freckles. Some genes make people more likely to get certain diseases, like high cholesterol or some cancers. Whether it's cancer, HIV, or antibiotic resistance, so much of modern medicine is influenced by people's genes. If only there was a way to change them the way we change a flat tire. It turns out there is. Using a technology called CRISPR, scientists can edit the DNA of the genes that make us who we are. CRISPR lets scientists locate a faulty gene, then cut the DNA strand where it's located to remove, fix, or replace it. The DNA then repairs the cut, and the body goes back to normal. So how can CRISPR advance medicine? It could eliminate inherited conditions, like sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. It could fight cancer by deleting genes to help immune cells attack tumors. It could treat HIV, herpes, or hepatitis by removing the virus's genetic information from the patient's cells. It could prevent antibiotic-resistant infections by removing the resistant genes from bacteria. While CRISPR can be revolutionary, it comes with questions about safety and ethical boundaries. That's why it's critical that scientists, like the experts at Penn, continue to safely and responsibly explore this groundbreaking technology for use only in patients with medical need. Because with clinical trials in progress around the world, CRISPR has the potential to change medicine forever.
So Marco, are we in science fact or are we in science fiction?
Oh yeah, I think we're in a very exciting time in medicine. This revolutionary technology, CRISPR, has already made a significant contribution to resolving specific inherited diseases, and I think we're definitely in the science fact part of this cycle. But of course, there's a lot of hype as well, and we can go into that.
So let us actually go and practically at this point in time using CRISPR, and in fact this year, 2 of the Nobel winners this year, in fact, were the inventors of CRISPR, 2 women. It was fantastic to see women at the cutting edge of science. They win the Nobel Prize. It's actually very unusual that within less than 10 years since the development of CRISPR, Nobel Prize has in fact been won. But what can we today actually do with it? What diseases can we solve?
It's a good question. And just to your point about the Nobel Prize, the fact that it was awarded so soon after the discovery is testament to its impact in medicine specifically. So so it really is a revolutionary technology. Look, the whole idea behind CRISPR, as the video quite nicely showed, is that you can go and fix genetic sequences and remove those sequences or add new sequences and correct a defect. And the key here is understanding what you're trying to do. And there are a subset of diseases where we actually have a very, very good understanding of what is the cause from a genetic point of view. And it's those diseases in particular where CRISPR becomes an extremely exciting proposition. For example, as was mentioned in the video, cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease are caused by single letter changes in the genome. You remove you remove those letters, or you change them back to their original normal sequence, and you've cured the patient. The ability to do that using CRISPR is a very, very exciting opportunity for medicine.
So are scientists today actually using it specifically for that? Can we cure sickle cell anemia at this point in time?
I believe the answer to that's yes. In fact, for sickle cell anemia in particular, the data coming out from various groups that have worked on it, including one of the companies I worked for a year ago, Vertex and CRISPR Therapeutics, is that we actually have a viable treatment. There's already patient data going 18 months where patients are no longer susceptible to these blood crises in sickle, and that's an amazing phase 1, phase 2 study that's been shown to be effective. Recently published actually a week ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. So we're looking at a potential cure for sickle, and it's at the forefront of solving this disease. There is no drug for this condition.
So at this point in time, are we looking for diseases that are contained in one simple genetic mutation rather than multiple mutations in the genes? Is that's where it's most applicable?
I think that's where the low-hanging fruit is today. Certainly, we do understand some complex multi-genetic diseases, but for the most part, those represent much more difficult propositions. Diseases where we know the gene that's causative, and where we can go in and fix that particular sequence, that is definitely right up there in terms of what we can do today. And in fact, what we're seeing with all these efforts.
So one of the first questions that came in this evening is, in fact, was hereditary diseases like hemophilia. Are we able to go in and fix that at this point in time, or are we still a little way down the road before we can do that?
I think hemophilia is on the radar. Hemophilia is caused by absence of specific specific blood clotting factors, and we can now go back and actually fix those genes and replace those factors genetically. And CRISPR is a technology that is being applied to those diseases, hemophilia A and hemophilia B in particular. Hemophilia B is a little bit easier. Hemophilia A is a bit tricky, but definitely they're available for fixing using CRISPR. And we will see within the next 5 years some clinical data for those two diseases.
Another question that's come in is autism. Is there a gene that we've identified yet with autism, and is CRISPR potentially an answer for that?
Yeah, I don't know the literature well enough in autism, but I do know it's a complex disease from a genetic point of view, and my feeling is that it's not really a single gene issue, and therefore, if we don't really understand the genetics well, it becomes difficult to decide what you're going to go and fix. And so I would say at this stage, autism is definitely not on the radar for a gene editing solution.
Just to add in, Howie, last I was looking at that, there's close to 1,000 candidate genes associated with a form of autism spectrum. And it's also going to be multifactorial, which means not just a whole bunch of genes, but also environmental factors as well. So I think it's probably a very, very complex disease to look at with CRISPR.
Right. So Marco, let's talk about some of the other diseases. There were recently in China, some scientists went and used CRISPR on an unborn fetus, and in fact tried to make the fetus resistant to HIV. And there was this huge international outcry saying the kid didn't have the disease. Why are we playing God by genetically modifying unborn children? Is that a legitimate comment?
I think in this case, it definitely is a legitimate outcry. The editing of germline cells, in other words, embryos, for such that the edits or the changes are going to be passed on throughout generations is something that's extremely ethically dubious at this point. And doing it even for medical purposes is something that needs a lot more discussion. And in this particular case, there was absolutely zero medical need for this particular type of intervention. These children could have easily been, there were other methods that we could have applied that ensured that these children did not carry the HIV infection, post-birth. So there was no need in this particular case as well. So the outcry is justified, and in fact, the doctor who did this is in jail, if I'm not mistaken, at the moment. So pretty serious.
A question that's come in, how does CRISPR work? Do you need to do it in an ovum? Do you do it in a bone marrow cell? How does it actually work?
CRISPR, by analogy, is just like a pair of scissors. The idea is that you can take this cutting tool and put it into a cell. And so the way it works is that if you can get it into cells of a specific tissue or a disease area, then you can go in and fix the genetics in that particular cell or tissue. Now, in germline, you would do it in the embryo. But again, like I said, that is an ethically dubious direction to take. In the case of the cystic fibrosis, you would do it in the lung. In the case of sickle cell disease, you would do it in blood stem cells, which you can actually remove from the body and actually do the editing outside of the body and then put that back into patients. So there's actually many different ways in which you can treat people with CRISPR or with any gene editing tool, as long as you know where you're going and what you're doing with it.
So a question comes in that says, are you able to fix genes in adults? So the answer is absolutely yes, you can.
Yeah, look, some tissue or parts of the body are much more difficult to edit than others. For example, going into the kidney or the brain is not as easy as the liver, for example, which it just turns out it's got nothing to do with CRISPR. It's got to do with the fact that getting stuff into the very large drugs like CRISPR into those different tissues and organs is actually really difficult. So it becomes much more of a delivery problem than it becomes a sort of a gene tool technology, editing tool technology problem. But definitely, you can edit the adults are treated all the time, and depending on the disease, there are definitely diseases that are very easy to get to, and others that are much more difficult. So that's the landscape.
You know, they say only fools and prophets predict the future, and I know you're not a fool, but let's try look 5-10 years down the road. Where do you think we'll be with gene editing? What will be the diseases, like the next 5-10 diseases that we'll be looking at that we think we can actually solve with this technology?
So I think all monogenic diseases, these are diseases caused by single genes defects, will be available for treatment in the future. In the near future, it will be ones that are in organs and tissues that are easy to get to, in patients where where fixing that gene has immediate impact. But in the long-term future, almost all these diseases are available. So almost all the diseases that are tested in these prenatal screening tests, Tay-Sachs, for example, Huntington disease, alpha antitrypsin disease, sickle cell disease. These are monogenic diseases. These are all going to be within the remit of a editing technology in the next 5 to 10 years.
So I don't know if you saw the Israelis published a paper in November talking about using CRISPR to attack cancer cells, to genetically modifying genes in order to attack cancer cells. Is potential the cancer treatment of the future all CRISPR related?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that study, but I do know of efforts to treat cancer with CRISPR, and it isn't as simple as one thinks. A lot of the CRISPR-related treatments in cancer have to do with building a sort of an immune system to cancer, using technology such as CAR-T. I'm sure some of your audience has heard of this. Basically, training the immune system to actually recognize cancer and treat cancer, and there are ways to do that with CRISPR, by reconfiguring the immune system to actually recognize the cancer. That's an exciting area, and definitely one worth paying attention to.
So many people are busy posting questions about specific diseases, but it's hard to get to because, you said one gene defect first, that's the low-hanging fruit. After that, one goes on to diseases that are two. But people have asked questions about Tay-Sachs, for example. I know when I was at university as part of Soldiers, we tried to encourage every Jewish student at university to go get tested to see if they were carriers of the Tay-Sachs mutant in their genes. Is that something that we can actually still fix?
I think it definitely will be something that's fixable in the future. But again, a lot of this can be fixed or so resolved by accurate testing. And so one doesn't always need to have to go and fix this condition, but definitely that is on the radar for being fixed in the future. Yeah.
So let's throw a few diseases at you, and the answers can actually be near, medium term, or distant future. Arthritis.
Arthritis, again, if there's a single gene that's known to cause arthritis, and again, there are many different types of arthritis, but if there's a single gene that is known to be a cause, then it's definitely a possibility. And I'm not sure I know of any single gene condition that is causative of arthritis. A good example would be gout, where it's caused by a uric acid deficiency. I don't think that necessarily qualifies as sufficiently serious enough to be treated by gene editing. Sometimes there are other drugs that are simpler, but I think that arthritis itself would be something a bit further off.
Okay, Parkinson's.
Yeah, so again, there are known genetic causes of Parkinson's that are well described. Those are available, like the LRRK2 gene is a known causative agent, and there are a couple of others. But for the vast majority of Parkinson's, it's still a polygenic or a multigenic disease, and therefore I think it's going to be a bit further off.
Alzheimer's?
Same with Alzheimer's.
And what about some of the ones that affect the mind? Things like epilepsy, depression.
Yeah, outside of my scope of expertise, Howie, but again, I know of a few of these conditions that are caused by single gene defects. And if there's a well-known single gene that is causative of this disease, then the biology suggests that we can replace that and fix and reverse the condition. Of course, there are situations, for example, in epilepsy for some diseases like Stargardt's and a few others, where that single gene needs to be fixed very early on, in early, maybe within the first few months after birth, because once the damage has manifested itself, it's almost impossible to reverse the condition, even if you fix the disease, the gene. So again, it depends a lot on the type of gene and what type of damage has ensued post through the lifespan of the patient.
So we were talking earlier about the BRCA gene, and Tanya Kohanovitz asked the question, is the BRCA gene something that potentially we could fix with CRISPR?
Yeah, yes.
So probably near future, or?
The trouble is that the BRCA gene is expressed everywhere. Obviously the lung is also a very large organ. So the feasibility of fixing a gene in many different locations in the body is going to be a major hurdle for this kind of, for treating BRCA. So again, that's going to, all these things are going to play into whether or not these things get done now, or whether we wait for better technologies for delivery, better delivery technologies to come around before those become feasible from a medical point of view.
I want to go back to some of the questions relating to ethics, because this idea of designer babies has to be something that we discuss. So we can identify certain genes, for example, that may make us taller or more muscular or potentially more intelligent. What are the genes that we've identified with, and what are the dangers for parents of wanting to have their kids slightly brighter, slightly better looking, more resistant to cancer? What do we actually know now about genes that people will start looking at, whether it's ethically dubious or not?
Yeah, so I don't think we actually know enough about the relationship between these kind of traits that people admire so much and specific single genes that are causative. I mean, we know, for example, muscularity in animals, in cattle, for example, we know that if we knock out a gene called myostatin, we get very muscular cattle. But would you ever really consider doing that as a bodybuilder? I think the consequences would be catastrophic, and we would not know what sort of outcomes we'd be facing. So the ethical nature of doing things like this are very dubious at best, even if there was some justifiable need. So I think cosmetic changes represent a spectrum of an area that is going to be very difficult for us to manage, and it's going to have to have we're going to have a lot of biological data to determine whether or not the single gene change you want to make will actually result in an outcome that is desirable, because it could be the other way around, and it could be something that you don't want to see. Yeah.
Is there in fact an intelligence gene?
I don't think so. Yeah, but I'm not sure. Maybe Scott's the right person to ask this question. Yeah.
So Scott, do you have a thought on that?
No, there's no.
No, you don't have a thought, or no, there isn't an intelligence gene?
There isn't an intelligence gene.
And what are the genes that we now discovering that we can associate with different traits and different things that people may find desirable?
I think Danny's got a couple that I think are well-known traits that can help athletes boost their oxygenation potential, things like that. I mean, there are those, but again, finding one gene that produces a marginal effect on a population is a very big, it's a very big jump to go from that to saying, well, let's fix that or change that and see some massive effect on an individual. That's in the realm of fantasy, in my view.
Just one other thing to add is that, of course, it's a very powerful technology, but there are potential risks. So you get what's called off-target effects. Right. So it's one thing to use this great technology when someone's got a serious disease, because the balance is quite clear. But if someone has got something else that can be treated in a different way, or actually isn't the problem, then it's a stupid thing to do.
So we're going to end in about 5 minutes, but I'm going to ask all three of our panelists to look at the question section and to select one or two questions that you would like to answer before we wrap up for this evening. So Danny, I'm sure I asked you to do that a few minutes ago, so I don't know if you have any favorite questions that you would like to give an answer to.
The one that I saw was around the confidentiality of the information. So yeah, just to assure people that the information in the test is strictly confidential. It's not used for research. It's not shared with research companies or insurance companies or anything like that. So it's strictly in the domain of you and your healthcare practitioner.
So could there be a problem once you've had a test done of your insurer, for example, asking to see your results? I think there's an issue with your sound, Danny. Sorry, your sound just went all strange.
Okay, that's better now.
No, I'm afraid not. Can I ask you to log off and log back on, and we'll ask Scott to answer a question or two while you do that. Or Scott, you're on mute.
Yes. Sorry, I did answer a few questions online. So there was a question my colleague Karen Milner asked about. I gave a very simple answer to the question of whether two identical twins had the same DNA, and I said the short answer is yes. And of course, the long answer is it's a bit more complex than that.
So I saw when you did answer that, someone questioned whether in fact medical evidence or legal evidence against a twin was permissible because you wouldn't know genetically which one, if you had DNA, had committed the crime.
Yes, so I think that's the question. So there are small differences that can be detected. The difficulty with it is that because they're so small, it's very expensive to detect it. And then there are also statistical questions of whether it could also be errors in the sequencing technology that's used. So it's a good plot for a novel.
Marco, what question would you like to answer?
So I think related to what you asked earlier, how he has a question from an anonymous attendee saying, what with gene modification, is there not a fear that it can be abused unethically to manufacture perfect human beings? And I think this is a question that I get asked from my own family, and many friends of mine. I think the unethical application of CRISPR and other genetic technologies is definitely something that we have to be concerned about. In my view, that it is possible to make gene alterations that do impact future generations, especially when one's dealing with germline editing. In other words, editing of embryos. And I think there's now a strong, I wouldn't say moratorium, but there's definitely a strong antagonism among all biological science that I've interacted with, and also from many of the scientific bodies, that we just do not go into doing any kind of germline editing, for the simple reason that we just do not know yet what we're going to be doing to people. Even if it's medically necessary, it's going to be difficult. So I think even though it may be difficult to see this, to see what kind of outcome we're producing, I think it's a no-go to do any kind of editing in embryos, so that we create new human beings with new traits. There is an interesting area though. One area of stem cell research is looking into creating organs in a dish. So, for example, taking stem cells from a patient and growing a new liver. And actually, here editing technology can play a big role. Now, whether or not we find that ethically problematic is something that I think still needs to be debated. But that type of technology is going to be something that's going to become more prevalent. So instead of having to wait for a donor, one could actually even grow your own organ outside of the body. And that's something
Marco, you raise a very interesting point. If you do treat someone for a disease and say it's a mother who later gives birth, do we have any idea whether in fact the changed gene will pass on to the child?
Yeah. So typically when editing is done locally in specific parts of the organs and tissue, the chances of editing the germline, in other words, the eggs or the sperm or the progenitors of those stem cells, is low, if not infinitesimally low. So the answer is that we do know that the chances are very, very low that we're going to get any kind of germline editing. And so I think unless you're actively taking embryonic cells and editing those, we will not be passing on that change throughout the next generation.
Cool. Danny, Bernard Kaplan says your sound could be CRISPR. Danny, are you with us or are you frozen? No, looks like Danny is frozen. We'll try and get him back. But a very interesting question that's come in from Margot about genes and COVID. Is there anything, Marco and Scott, that we've learned, and I don't know if Danny's back with us yet, but is there anything that we've learned about the human genome and the COVID disease?
Yeah, again, not sure I've been following all the literature here, but I do think there are many receptors that have been identified now that are targets for entry or for interaction with the virus, and those receptors tell us a lot about how much virus is going to be needed to infect a patient, to what extent we're going to be susceptible to a more severe infection. That kind of data is starting to trickle in, and an understanding of what factors are going to make a patient respond better to the drugs that are available, as well as to what extent we can mount an accurate immune system, that immune responses. That's coming in, and I think we're starting to see a lot of that data today. And so we'll soon, maybe soon, also have tests available that will give us information right away as to what type of treatment we're going to be needing to take should we get infected. That's something that we can probably see in the future.
So Scott, I'd like to ask you, because the first two vaccines that have come out have been RNA vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which hasn't yet been FDA approved, but Pfizer looks like it was approved yesterday and will come before the CDC today. But those are going to be the first RNA vaccines that we've ever used. Is there a danger to that? Would you be at the front of the queue to get either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, Scott?
So the answer to that is yes. I think I would be. I think that they've been, even though the timelines have been very short, I think they have been rigorously tested, and I think we can see what a risk COVID-19 is. So I would be quite happy to take those vaccines. Of course, with any vaccine, even though we know that there are risks, and that's why there are such rigorous tests in place, even for something as serious as COVID. But I'd be very comfortable at taking any of the vaccines that are approved through the proper processes.
And your thoughts on an RNA vaccine, given that we're in new territory now?
I don't see it as particularly a problem. I think traditional immunological approaches also have risks. So I'm quite comfortable about taking these RNA vaccines.
Marco, our Chief Justice and President of the Constitutional Court gave a speech a day or two ago warning people about the mark of the devil in the vaccines. Do you have any concerns about RNA vaccines at all?
No, in fact, as someone who has worked with Moderna in the past, they're an outstanding company, and the mRNA technology is really quite amazing. I think people were worried at one point because they heard mRNA and it sounds very similar to DNA, that maybe you're going to go and manipulate DNA. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a technology that is well established, well thought out. It will produce a protein that will result in a very strong immune response. In fact, the phase 3 data is spectacular. And that's why we're seeing these approved in record pace. So I would have no hesitation whatsoever taking this vaccine when I can get my hands on it.
Cool. Danny, you're back with us. Can we hear you?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Great.
Alex.
No problem. So Bernard Kaplan said that your sound needed to be crisper. Answer us one question of your choice, and then we're going to come back to all the panelists for one last word of summation before we wrap up for this evening.
So I saw a question come through in the chat about genes that make people more susceptible to COVID, which I thought was quite an interesting question. I think, again, it's where the ethics come in of where we are with information that sits within research and what is ready for application in a commercial setting. So there are certainly some candidate genes. There's a lot of research that is ongoing, but there's certainly nothing that at this point I would want to offer commercially. It's just, way too risky to go and tell somebody that they don't have those genes and then they think they can sort of behave accordingly. So it's early days when it comes to genetic and susceptibility to more severe forms of COVID.
So Danny, we've had a few requests. I see Penny and a few other people have once again asked for your website. So the analysis, please, if you can just put the website into the chat section. I think there are many people who want to go and get a healthcare provider to to in fact go look and examine some of it. So Marco, let's start with you. Your final words and thoughts for this evening, and then we're going to ask people, as we have our final thoughts, to please comment in both the YouTube chat section as well as the Zoom chat section as well about your thoughts. What are your fears? What are your hopes? Where do you think medicine's going? And most importantly, whether you've ever had your DNA analyzed either for heritage or alternatively for medical purposes. And do you think there'd be any surprises in your DNA? I was quite surprised to be 98.5% Ashkenazi. I thought I'd have a little more mix in me. Do you think you have any hidden secrets hidden in your DNA? But Marco, last word and thoughts from you.
Yeah, just thank you, Howie. This has actually been a fascinating session. I just wanted to mention that I think we're in the golden age of medical advances at the moment, and the number of different technologies and tools that are coming and that are out there today that are being applied. I think we couldn't have hoped for some of these conditions to be treated the way they are today 10 years ago. We're now seeing diseases that where there was no hope. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, sickle cell, cystic fibrosis, where today there are now possible treatments and therapies available to these patients. And I think that's such an exciting development. And I think CRISPR is one component of many new tools and technologies that we are going to be seeing in the next few years bear fruit in the medical field. So I think it's an exciting time to be a scientist in this era. And it's going to be exciting for the many patients that are waiting for therapies too.
Amazing. Scott, we must be doing something fantastically well in South Africa to be able to produce people like yourself and Marco and Danny. We clearly are not laggards in this around the world with what's happening really at the cutting edge of technology.
I think that there's an incredible history and strength of South African science. And I'd just like to agree with Marco. I think it's a very exciting time to be a scientist, and we're starting to see great revolutions that come out of DNA. And just a final word I would say is that I know it can be challenging for people who are not scientifically trained, but I think it's very important that people try and equip themselves to understand the benefits and the potential risks of the different technologies and applications that we've all spoken about, so that you're able to understand what can be offered.
So Danny, the final word goes to you. Give us your last piece of advice.
Well, it might be a bit of a cliche, but I think with great power comes great responsibility. And I think with all the talk of the technology and the science and how far advanced we are, it's great that there's been so much time this evening talking about the ethics and the responsibility of scientists to do things properly and to do things the right way, because these types of technologies are open to abuse. You've got a largely unknowing public who can be easily misled. I think it's really important that we remember the ethical and the side of things that are right, and we do things the right way, and we use the technology for good and for advancing science and advancing healthcare, and we stay on the right side of the ethics.
Amazing. Well, to our three panelists this evening, a huge thank you for giving of your time. Really, I think we've consolidated over the period of 2 hours, really almost all the important questions that need to be answered. But there are so many questions, but there are lots of resources for people. Just go on the web, do some research, look at YouTube, find some videos. But one of the questions that was asked earlier is, will this video be available for people to watch? And yes, of course, all of the Jewish Report's webinars are available on YouTube to watch. You just go onto the SA Jewish Report on YouTube. And in fact, there are 67, 68 webinars for you to watch. Great viewing over the Hanukkah Christmas festive season. If you Christmas as well. So really, some amazing viewing. We'll be back tomorrow night, that's Sunday night at 5:30, where we're going to light Hanukkah candles with Buji Herzog, the chairman of the Jewish Agency, and Yair Lapid, who is leader of the opposition in Israel. We're even going to try play you a Hanukkah song featuring Bibi Netanyahu, and we've got Judy Cohen, and we've got Chaya Singer, and we got Adina Roth, and we got Zev Krengel and Sean Zaganov. We're going to have a communal candle lighting, and I think That's one of the amazing things that we've learned tonight. No matter what you look like, no matter where you come from, whether you have Italian heritage or Scottish heritage or Eastern European heritage, whether you're Jewish from China or India or Lemba, it actually makes no difference at all. We are one people, one remarkable species, and we have to be kind to each other no matter where we come from and no matter what we do. We'll see you all tomorrow night. Please leave us a comment in the chat. Don't forget as well, if you haven't got your latest edition of the Jewish Report newspaper, please go either online, www.sajr.co.za, or alternatively into your local supermarket or Discount or Spaza shop, or alternatively Garage shop, and go pick up a copy of the Jewish Report. We'll see you tomorrow evening. Stay safe, stay sanitized, and please, for those people going away, please be careful. We're in the middle of the second surge. Wear your mask at all times. Good night to everyone. We'll see you again. Thank you to our panelists. Greatly, greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.